Hello, this is Brian Birdwell and welcome to Session 7. Today we're going to start by looking at the second half of the analytical writing assessment, analysis of an argument. It's very similar to the essay we described last week, and at the same time it's very different. Just a quick review that there are two essays at the very beginning, the issue essay, the argument essay, half hour for each of them, and they don't factor into your score, and it's probable that no one will ever read them. Now, the analysis of an argument essay is very different from the other essay in the sense that the other essay asks you to take a side of an issue, whereas this essay simply asks you to analyze the argument being presented. So you are not being asked for your own opinion in this regard. So you're going to have to follow three different steps in the beginning. First of all, you need to understand what the argument is that you're being presented with in the first place. So find the argument's conclusion. And by the way, in the second half of today's verbal lesson, we're going to be talking about reading comprehension arguments, and that's going to be a great way for you to practice your analysis of these issues. It'll be a lot easier for you once you've gone through the practice and the training for approaching those problems on the reading comprehension section. So you're already going to be hip and primed for finding argument conclusions. You're just going to be used to doing it in reading comprehension problems, and you have to apply it to the essay prompt. So note that there's going to be several ideas presented, these premises that sort of form a chain of logic leading to a conclusion. And there are going to be holes in that chain, parts where it's broken, where you could think of good counterexamples, where the author is making obvious assumptions, etc. And you want to consider those. And finally, just like the other essay, you want to make sure that you hit all of the specific marks in the instructions. So here's an example of the kind of prompt you could be given. You might stop and ask yourself here, what is the conclusion of this argument? And conclusions of arguments often have these superlative terms like the best way to do something, an evaluation, a judgment, an opinion. So here the conclusion of this prompt is that the mayor says this is the best way to fund the road repair. And what are his reasons? Well, he really just has the one reason, that since the hotel will be cheaper in Blodgett than it is in Renton, we're going to make enough money to fund the repair. Clearly, you can see that this argument has a number of issues. Here are two examples of the instructions you could be given. The other 6 possible sets of instructions are included in the handout. I'll give you a moment to consider them. Notice that each of these is essentially the same thing, analyzing the argument and breaking it down. One of them specifically asks what evidence you'd like, and the other specifically asks what assumptions are being made in the argument. So your analysis here, or your ability to analyze this argument, will depend on your ability to deconstruct the argument, to break it up into pieces and to find the flaws. Now, when thinking about flaws, there are any number of ways to categorize the common flaws, to name the common flaws. So feel free to use your own naming conventions. So we're going to go through an exercise here and look at several of the most common and repeated logical flaws, not just on the GRE, but in general, in arguments that people make all the time, in arguments that your best friend has made or your mother has made to you, in arguments that you see coworkers getting in arguments that you've seen pundits on television have discussing politics and whatnot. These flaws occur all around us in logic. So regardless of what you call them, the important thing is that you learn to recognize them. So let's take a look at that same prompt again and think about what are some of the issues that you would attack if you were on the opposite side of the table from a person making this argument. What would you say? Here are some suggestions. One way of looking at it is that there are unjustified assumptions here, that this mayor is making a huge assumption when saying, because our hotels will be cheaper, the tourists will stay here. Well, that's a huge assumption. What if there is nothing for the tourists to do in Blodgett City, but Renton has several attractive tourist destinations, spas, or something unique in their town that gets tourists to come off the highway and visit them, or an antique shop. You know how tourist things go, whatever it may be. So a big assumption here that just because we lower the price, all of a sudden we're going to have more tourists. It might be more complex than that. Extreme language is always very easy to attack, whether the speaker says that something will never happen or says that something will always be the case, the worst thing, the best thing, etc. So if you want to claim that, it will always be the case, you have to prove that there are no exceptions. If you want to prove that something is the best, you have to prove that all the other cases out there are inferior. This is almost impossible to do. So these are assumptions that are sort of included in arguments automatically. So when you think of it this way, almost every single argument is flawed in that it requires at least some assumptions to be true. Also, predicting the future is a dicey territory to get into. Anytime you're predicting the future, you've admitted a certain degree of uncertainty into your argument. So if we're here talking about what will happen in the future, it's very easy to attack that and just to say, what if something changes? Yeah, what if we have a natural disaster? You can just play the what if game. What if the other city, again, has a roller coaster or something else that attracts tourists? It's always hard to predict the future. So these three things then might form our body paragraphs. And we might spend a paragraph talking about the assumption, a paragraph talking about the extreme language, and another paragraph talking about the difficulty predicting the future. And our paragraphs don't have to be long-winded and winding roads. 3 sentences, a minimum, is a paragraph. So if you can write 3, 4, or even 5 sentences about each of these issues, and then slap an introduction and a conclusion on it, you're good to go. Let's look at a few other examples and some different kinds of flaws. So here's a new prompt, and I'd like you to consider what new kinds of flaws are introduced in this one. I'll give you guys about a minute to read it and think about it. All right, now just because whatever you wrote doesn't appear on my list doesn't mean that you're wrong in any sort of way. But let me show you a couple of examples that work here. The first one is the troubled analogy, which is very common anytime apples are compared to oranges. Well, they did it in Colorado. Surely it'll work in Texas. Or, they're doing it in Canada. Of course we should do it in the United States. Immediately, you open yourself up to the question of what if those states or those nations or those examples are too different to be comparable in this way? What if they're different in so many important ways that the exact opposite remedy would be most effective in the other case? So the moment a speaker introduces an analogy, that analogy is asking to be attacked. The other big one that I see in this one is sort of questioning the motivation here. Why would the ABC design firm put out this report? Maybe it's just because they're trying to attract a certain kind of employee. So they're like, hey, we're the kind of company that lets its employees bring their kids to work, and we're finding this helps our business. For example, in the troubled analogy part of this, just to be specific here, it's not just that they could be different. You'd want to think of specific ways that they could be different. Perhaps the design firm is full of young and hip, sort of technology-oriented folks. And so it's a very easy sort of environment to have kids in because it's more creative. Whereas the bookbinding company might be more like a manufacturing plant where it might take so much time and energy and effort to keep the kids safe that it would be counterproductive to have them around. Something like this. So it's not just that they're different that the problem. You want to actually think of something specific that could make them different. And motivation is always a good one to question when the firm in question has submitted their own research or their own evidence. So it's easy to attack that their motivations might be causing them to publish this report. Perhaps the claims have been exaggerated in the report. Or perhaps it's because they're trying to appear a certain way because that design firm has different goals than the bookbinding company. So since the design firm is expanding, trying to attract new, young, and creative types, then they're sort of having this kids at work program. Whereas the bookbinding company just could be such a different business that there's no need for them to do such gimmicks or to practice such things in order to attract the types of employees that they need. This kind of thing. So we sort of work from the abstract, like what's possibly wrong with this, and then fill in the gaps with specific ideas or suggestions along the way. So you can already tell that this essay, the argument essay, takes a little more creative thought, a little more analytic thought than the issue essay that we discussed last week. Let's look at another one. Here, another very flawed argument. It has some pretty obvious gaping holes in it that we can attack. Because specifically it's a cause and effect argument. So you always want to be aware when an argument is causal, when it's saying X caused Y. And here, of course, the final sentence is the conclusion. The diversity training reduced discrimination at the company. Now, what evidence do you have that the training reduced discrimination? And the answer is really none. Before the survey, or excuse me, before the training, they had complaints. After the training, no complaints. Therefore, they conclude there's been a reduction in discrimination. Now, notice that switch. What we know is that there's been a reduction in complaints. we actually have no idea whether discrimination itself has actually been reduced. So this is just, we lump this into a category called confusing signs of a thing for the thing itself. So we say reduced discrimination. The only evidence we have is that complaints of discrimination have been reduced. And of course, there's always the idea that, wait, how do you know those are even the same employees? We did a survey before, we did a survey after the training, but maybe all the discriminating people had already quit or been fired and left, were gone. So perhaps the troublemakers, maybe there was only one person, and everyone was complaining about that one person. That one person got fired and they had the training. And really, they didn't need the training. Just that one person getting fired could have lowered or reduced the discrimination. And the training just happened to be there. Perhaps employees also, are just sort of, they don't want to go to any more trainings, so they stop complaining. They saw it almost as punishment. Oh, please don't make me go to another 2-day training. So I'll just stop complaining. There are a number of ideas here under these headings of confusing signs of the thing for the thing itself, and the fact that things are always changing. How do we know that this is the same group of people? And this last point is a great segue into this prompt and potential flaws here. So we have a longer prompt here, a longer argument, which is typically a good thing because that could give us more room to attack, more assumptions to spot, more terms to disagree with or to ask for definition, etc. First of all, of course, you want to identify the conclusion here. And the last one, the last sentence is probably it. Notice these key words, and we're going to talk about this in a little more detail in the reading comprehension portion of today's lesson, but we have these great key words that indicate whether we are looking at something that supports an idea, in other words, is a premise, or a conclusion. And notice in this argument how we kind of have two candidates for conclusion. The first thing presented is just a fact. We have a researcher discovering something. So there's this correlation. You score lower on cardiovascular tests. You also score lower on reading tests. Then the researcher makes their own conclusion, and they conclude causation, which is very important to recognize, that this researcher, based on a correlation, is concluding causation, which is on its face a huge flaw. And then the researcher goes even farther, and based on this sort of intermediate conclusion here, the conclusion drawn on the basis of the study, the researcher goes on to make recommendations for how teachers should deal with the situation. So there's kind of two conclusions embedded here, with the final conclusion in the chain, the call to action, kind of being the major conclusion here. So correlation versus causation is very common. You're likely to see it on the reading comprehension, and there's a good chance you could see a causal argument presented as your essay prompt as well. But just because they go together, it doesn't mean that one causes the other. So our first objection could be, no. It's the fact that they have low reading skills that's causing them not to go out and run. Now, that may not make a lot of logical sense, but it's still possible. Or a third factor, perhaps genetics or some other socioeconomic issue, could be causing these low scores in both areas. So just because X and Y happen together doesn't mean that X and Y are causing one another. Also, notice this very important difference in language, that we know that the kids are scoring lower on reading tests. But what does this have to do with interest in reading? Because they score low on the test, does that mean they're not interested in reading? These are not the same thing. That's an important omission on the author's part, or an assumption, perhaps. Also, the skill and will is a great category for just, do they have the skills to do this, and do they have the motivation to do this? So is it possible for teachers to improve a kid's cardiovascular health? How would they do that? Are they qualified to? And do they want to? Amidst all the myriad tasks that teachers already have in front of them, is this really something else that they're going to be motivated to take on? Again, there are more ways that you could attack this particular argument. These are just a few suggestions designed to get you sort of hip to these common categories and looking for them. The complete list is available in Chapter 10 of the Reading Comprehension and Essays book, where each of these flaws is discussed in greater detail as well. So feel free to turn to the strategy guide to get a little more in-depth look at each of these areas. Let's keep moving. All right, first steps first, identifying the conclusion. Here we have the great conclusion indicator word, therefore. Therefore, the database sales group will win the award for highest quarterly sales. So already we've seen this repeated error of predicting the future. Very dicey territory to predict the future. On what basis is the author predicting that this sales group will win? Well, the only real piece of evidence presented here is that it has increased beyond its expectations. And last year, they placed third. So what's really interesting is, despite the fact that no other sales group has experienced an increase, well, how far behind the first and second place runners was this group? In other words, if first place was 1,000,000 units ahead, and the third place group did improve and increase, by 100,000 points, that's not enough to overtake the first place runners. So we could question the numbers here. There's no numbers presented, only sort of vague increases, and we don't know how the group increased relative to others. So we need some quantification here if we're actually going to be able to make these predictions valid. Also, what is beyond expectations? Maybe the expectations were super low. Maybe they expected the group to go down and they went up 1 point. This is not overwhelming evidence that they're actually going to win the award this year. All right, a minute 15 to look at this one. Again, we've got the great indicator word therefore at the end of this argument. Therefore, everyone should consider jogging 8 miles a day to ward off the flu. Now, why is that? Because there was a study with 150 volunteers who agreed to jog 8 miles a day, and they had lower incidence of the colds and flu. Now, a few things might jump out to you immediately here. What kind of volunteer is going to jog 8 miles? Or rather, what kind of person is going to volunteer to jog 8 miles? Perhaps these people are already super healthy. Perhaps they're already super fit, and they're already less likely to get the flu or cold. So, in terms of general categories, we could call this an unrepresentative sample. Also, anytime an argument presents a sample survey as evidence, you should just attack, or at least ask the questions. Is the sample representative? Is the sample large enough? And here, 150 people, and then we're recommending that everyone should consider jogging 8 miles a day. That is an enormous generalization. Did they have old ladies with osteoporosis? Did they have pregnant women? Did they have children? It's highly unlikely that 150 people actually are representative of everyone. So we can attack it on two different grounds. It's sort of like the sample is the one piece of evidence, but we can attack it for multiple reasons. And the other question is, how are these people before the study? Again, what if they were already super fit triathletes that are never sick in the first place? Does the study really prove that their jogging 8 miles is what's keeping them free of sickness? And this isn't all with this one. There are a few more. Let's look at the next page here. In addition to attacking the sample or asking how the conditions existed before, we can say that there was no control group for this study. So again, you can see that anytime a group of people is submitted, a survey sample, that really makes an argument vulnerable to lots of attacks and questions. This is also a causal argument, just like a few of the ones that we've seen today. And it's important to recognize that. They are suggesting that jogging 8 miles causes resistance to the cold and flu. But we could always bring up the idea that maybe that's not what caused it. Maybe there's a brand new flu shot that's been given away for free. Maybe the cold and flu are down everywhere in the world, or everywhere in the region, or everywhere in the country. Perhaps cold and flu incidences are at an all-time low. Perhaps the president had a new fitness program going on at the same time. So there's always other causes that could contribute. And finally, what about the long-term view here? The study was a few weeks long, and therefore it's saying we should just jog 8 miles a day. And they don't say we should jog 8 miles a day for several weeks. They say we should jog 8 miles a day, which is kind of ridiculous on its face. So if you recognize that a conclusion is kind of ridiculous, it's easier to find ways to attack it. And there are a number of dimensions, as we've seen, for attacking these. Once you have analyzed the argument and you've spotted some of the flaws, do a quick brainstorm for how you're going to organize that information in an outline. So in the introductory paragraph, you're going to basically restate the argument. That's one thing that you want to do. Don't assume that the reader knows the prompt. So inform them of what's happening and establish your position. So here's what I think. Remember, you're not taking a side like you were in the issue essay, but you need to establish your take. And basically that means I think this argument was flawed for reason 1, reason 2, and reason 3. And each of those reasons will make up a body paragraph, and then your conclusion will summarize the issue, will basically be a repetition of your introduction. It's very important here to remember that you're going to be saying the same thing several times in any one of these arguments. Just make sure that you say it in different ways each time. And also, be sure to hit the specific marks that the instructions ask you to take into consideration. So if the argument or if the task asks you to take into account assumptions, make sure you take into account assumptions. Just like the other essay, you get extra points if you have a mix of long and short sentences. Don't overreach your vocabulary. Keep it in a comfortable range. Don't try to be impressive with words that you don't actually know, and try to write as much as possible. Again, a reminder of the resources available in addition to reading Chapter 10 of the Strategy Guide for more information about these flaws, and in addition to practicing your reading comprehension arguments homework, which we're about to discuss in the second verbal portion of Session 7, you can check out these resources as well.